She spoke Italian to calm a lost child. The Mafia boss froze and ordered, "Find everything about her." The moment I heard the little boy crying in Italian, I should have walked away. But I've always been the girl who stops, who helps, who gets involved. That afternoon in Riverside Park, my kindness was about to drag me into a world where mercy is weakness and walking away is never an option. If you're ready to enjoy this story, click that subscribe button, like this video, and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps me bring more wonderful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get back to the story. The little boy couldn't have been more than 5 years old, standing in the middle of Riverside Park's sun-dappled pathway, tears streaming down his cherubic face as dozens of afternoon joggers and dog walkers passed without stopping. His clothes, a navy polo shirt with an embroidered crest and perfectly pressed khaki shorts that probably cost more than I made in a week, marked him as someone from serious money. But that didn't stop the crowd from averting their eyes, picking up their pace, pretending not to notice. Modern America at its finest. See something, feel uncomfortable, keep scrolling through life. But I'd never been good at looking away. "Hey, sweetheart." I knelt beside him on the warm pavement, keeping my voice soft and steady. "Are you lost? Can you tell me your name?" He looked at me with enormous dark eyes swimming with panic and said something I didn't understand. Not English. I tried Spanish. I'd picked up conversational Spanish, working with international clients as a freelance translator. "¿Estás perdido? ¿Dónde está tu mamá?" He just sobbed harder, his little chest heaving. Then I caught it, a word tumbling through his tears that sounded like mama. Italian. The child was speaking Italian. I'd spent 2 years in Bologna during graduate school, had fallen completely in love with the language, the literature, the way vowels could carry entire emotions. I'd continued studying after returning to New York, taking advanced courses online, maintaining my fluency because it connected me to the version of myself who believed the world was still full of beauty and possibility. That impractical skill, the one my practical father had called a waste of tuition money, was about to calm a terrified child. "Non piangere, amore," I said softly in Italian, my accent probably rusty but sincere.
"Sto qui con te. Come ti chiami?"
"Don't cry, sweetheart. I'm right here with you. What's your name?" His entire body went still with recognition and relief. "Nico," he whispered, his voice breaking.
"Mi chiamo Nico."
His words came faster then, tumbling out in rapid Italian mixed with hiccuping sobs. He'd been walking with his papa. He'd seen a golden retriever and chased it across the grass. And now he couldn't find anyone. Everyone spoke languages he didn't understand. He was scared. He wanted his papa.
"Va bene, Nico."
"Troveremo tua papa," I promised, taking his small, trembling hand in mine. "It's okay, Nico. We'll find your father."
"Resta con me, okay?"
He nodded, gripping my hand like I was the only solid thing in a spinning world, his tears finally slowing to quiet sniffles. I looked around the park, mentally running through options. Park security booth near the entrance. Police station 3 blocks south. Lost and found at the visitor center. But before I could decide, I noticed them. 3 men in tailored black suits moving through the crowd with the kind of precision that made my instincts scream danger. Not joggers who happened to wear suits. Not businessmen cutting through the park. These men moved like a military unit, scanning faces, speaking into nearly invisible earpieces, parting the crowd without touching anyone. They were clearly searching for something. Or someone.
"Nico, questi uomini sono con tuo papà?"
Asked carefully, trying to keep my voice calm. "Are these men with your father?" Nico looked up, and his face transformed with desperate hope.
"Sì. Marco. Marco."
He started waving his free hand frantically. One of the men, presumably Marco, spotted us, and his entire demeanor shifted. Relief crashed across his hard features as he spoke rapidly into his sleeve. The other 2 immediately changed trajectory, converging on our location with frightening speed. They surrounded us within 10 seconds flat. I instinctively pulled Nico closer to my side, my protective instincts overriding logic. These were clearly security, probably legitimate. But something about the coiled violence in their movements, The way they positioned themselves in a defensive formation, the bulges beneath their suit jackets that I really hoped weren't what I thought they were, it all made my heart hammer against my ribs. Nico. Marco knelt down, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as he checked the boy for injuries, speaking rapid Italian.
Stai bene? Sei ferito?
Then his eyes, cold, assessing, dangerously intelligent, landed on me. You found him. His English was perfect, barely accented, but carried an edge. Thank you. He was lost and scared, I said, keeping my voice steady even though my pulse was racing. I just stayed with him until…
Chi è questa donna?
A voice cut through the afternoon air like a blade, commanding, cold, and absolutely saturated with barely controlled fury. Who is this woman? I turned toward the voice and felt every thought evaporate from my mind. The man walking toward us was devastating in a way that had nothing to do with conventional attractiveness and everything to do with raw, terrifying power. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. My name is Amber Collins, I'm 28 years old, and until that sun-soaked afternoon in May, the most dangerous thing in my life was deciding whether to renew my month-to-month lease in a neighborhood where the rent kept climbing. I was a linguistics graduate turned freelance translator, which is a fancy way of saying I worked from my cramped studio apartment in oversized sweaters, survived on coffee and optimism, and occasionally wondered if my father had been right about choosing a more practical career path. I'd never broken a law, never even gotten a speeding ticket. The closest I'd come to danger was accepting a dinner date with a guy whose Tinder profile turned out to be 7 years and 30 pounds outdated. So when I tell you that everything changed the day I met Nico Gardner, and more importantly, his father, I mean it changed in ways I couldn't have imagined even in my most paranoid moments. But let's start at the beginning. I made it home in a daze, my hands still shaking as I fumbled with my apartment keys. The man's face, Tony Gardner's face, kept replaying in my mind like a film stuck on loop. The way he looked at me after hearing me speak Italian to Nico. Not with gratitude. Not with simple relief. With something far more unsettling, focused, calculating interest. Like a predator recognizing something rare and deciding whether to let it run or claim it. When Marco had murmured something in rapid Italian to him, something I'd caught only fragments of, including La Ragazza and Italiano, Tony's jaw had tightened. His eyes, dark and impossibly intense, had held mine for what felt like an eternity. Then he'd said something that made my blood run cold. I'd only caught part of it because he'd spoken in a low, clipped tone meant only for Marco's ears. But my Italian was good enough. Too good. Scopri tutto su di lei. Find everything about her. I'd left as quickly as I could after that, mumbling something about needing to get home, backing away from the circle of dangerous men while Nico called after me, asking when I'd come back. Tony had simply watched me retreat, silent and still, like a king observing a subject who'd just unknowingly entered his court. Now, safely inside my tiny studio apartment, I did what any reasonable person in the digital age would do when they just encountered someone terrifying. I Googled him. My laptop screen glowed in the dimming afternoon light as I typed, Tony Gardner, New York. The results loaded, and my heart dropped into my stomach. Anthony Tony Gardner, alleged head of Gardner Syndicate, New York Times. Federal investigation into Gardner crime family stalls again, Wall Street Journal. Mafia boss or businessman? The untouchable Tony Gardner, New York Post. I clicked the first article with trembling fingers. Anthony Gardner, 34, alleged head of the Gardner Syndicate, one of New York's most powerful organized crime families, has evaded prosecution for over a decade despite federal investigations into racketeering, money laundering, illegal gambling operations, and suspected ties to international smuggling networks. Known for his ruthless business acumen and seemingly untouchable legal status, Gardner operates a complex empire of legitimate businesses that federal prosecutors believe serve as fronts for criminal enterprises. I clicked another article, then another. Each one painted the same picture. Tony Gardner wasn't just wealthy. He wasn't just powerful. He was allegedly one of the most dangerous men in New York City. A crime lord who operated with impunity, whose lawyers were more feared than most judges, whose business rivals had a disturbing tendency to disappear or suddenly relocate. And I had just spent 20 minutes with his son. Oh God, I whispered to my empty apartment. Oh God, oh God, oh God. I'd walked straight into the life of a mafia boss. I'd touched his child. I'd spoken a language that clearly meant something significant to him, something private, something that made him take notice. Find everything about her. The words echoed in my memory, taking on new and terrifying weight. I slammed my laptop shut and stood up, pacing my small space. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe he'd just been ensuring I wasn't a threat. Maybe in a day or two, this would all be forgotten. I tried to believe that. I really did. But the next morning, when I left my building to grab coffee, there was a black SUV parked across the street. Tinted windows. Engine running. No one getting in or out. Just sitting there. I told myself it was coincidence. New York was full of expensive cars. When I came back 20 minutes later, it was still there. That afternoon, I went to the grocery store 3 blocks away. As I was debating between overpriced organic tomatoes and slightly less overpriced regular ones, I noticed him, a man in a dark suit standing near the pharmacy section, pretending to read the label on a bottle of aspirin. He'd been behind me in the produce section. And before that, near the entrance. My pulse kicked up. I abandoned my cart and left through the side exit. The man didn't follow me out, but when I glanced back, he was speaking into his phone, his eyes tracking my movement through the window. By the 3rd day, I was sure. When I returned to my building after meeting a client at a coffee shop downtown, there was a man sitting in my lobby. Designer suit, crisp white shirt, reading a newspaper like he belonged there. But our building didn't have a doorman, didn't have that kind of security. And I'd never seen him before. He looked up as I entered, his eyes meeting mine for just a fraction of a second too long. I took the stairs instead of the elevator, my heart pounding. Inside my apartment, I leaned against the door, breathing hard. This is insane. This is actually insane. I was being watched. Followed. Surveilled. Tony Gardner had given an order, and his people were executing it with terrifying efficiency. I grabbed my phone, my finger hovering over 911. But what would I say? Hello, yes, I helped a mafia boss's son, and now I think I'm being followed by well-dressed men who haven't actually threatened me or done anything illegal? I set the phone down. Maybe if I just stayed invisible. Went about my normal life. Gave them nothing interesting to report. Maybe they'd get bored and leave me alone. I desperately wanted to believe that. But somewhere in a mansion across the city, in an office filled with leather and old money and the weight of power, Tony Gardner sat in a high-backed chair, a thin manila folder open on the desk before him. Marco stood at attention nearby, silent. Tony's fingers traced the edge of the first page, a photograph clipped to the corner. A candid shot from my LinkedIn profile, me smiling at a conference, looking young and naive and completely unprepared for what was coming. Amber Collins, Tony said quietly, reading. 28. Linguistics graduate, Columbia University. Freelance translator. Fluent in Italian, Spanish, French. Currently residing alone at. He rattled off my address without looking up. No criminal record. No remarkable debts. No family in New York, parents deceased, car accident, 4 years ago. He closed the folder. His expression was unreadable, but his dark eyes held something that looked almost like fascination. Keep watching her, he said finally. I want to know everywhere she goes. Everyone she speaks to. He paused. And Marco? Make sure she knows she's being watched. But don't scare her. Marco's eyebrow raised slightly. Boss? Tony's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. I want her aware. But not running. Not yet. And if she contacts the police? Tony leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. She won't, he said with absolute certainty. She's too smart for that. She's already realized who I am. And she's trying to decide what to do about it. He opened the folder again, his eyes settling on my photograph. Give her 3 more days, Tony murmured, almost to himself. Then I'll make the next move. The 4th day of surveillance, I broke. Not in a dramatic way, no screaming, no confrontation with the men following me. I just stopped pretending everything was normal. Stopped leaving my apartment except for absolute necessities. Stopped answering emails from potential clients. I existed in a state of suspended animation, waiting for something to happen, knowing it would but not knowing when. The waiting was worse than any direct threat could have been. It was a Tuesday evening, nearly 7 o'clock, when I finally forced myself to leave the apartment. I needed groceries. Actual food, not the crackers and peanut butter I'd been surviving on. I couldn't hide forever. I told myself that as I locked my apartment door, as I descended the 4 flights of stairs, as I pushed open the building's heavy front door into the cooling evening air. And then I saw him. Tony Gardner was leaning against the brick wall beside my building's entrance, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than 6 months of my rent. His white shirt was open at the collar, revealing the edges of intricate tattoos that crawled up his neck and disappeared beneath the fabric. A silver watch caught the streetlight. He looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine spread titled, "Danger You Wanna Touch." But it was his stillness that terrified me most. He wasn't checking his phone, wasn't looking around impatiently. He was simply waiting, with the infinite patience of a predator who knows his prey has nowhere to run. The moment I appeared, his dark eyes locked onto mine. My entire street seemed to hold its breath. The usual evening sounds, traffic, distant sirens, neighbors arguing through open windows, all faded into white noise. I was suddenly, viscerally aware that every person within a 2-block radius had either stopped what they were doing or changed direction. The black SUV parked at the corner. The man in the suit across the street pretending to smoke. The woman who'd been walking her dog suddenly deciding to turn around. This was Tony Gardner's world, and it had just swallowed my neighborhood whole. "Ms. Collins." His voice was low, almost gentle. It made my skin prickle. "We need to talk." I should have run. Should have screamed. Should have ducked back inside and called someone. Anyone. Instead, I heard myself say, "You've been having me followed." Yes. No denial. No apology. Just simple acknowledgement, like he was confirming the weather. "Why?" He pushed off the wall with fluid grace, taking a single step toward me. I forced myself not to retreat, even though every instinct screamed at me to put distance between us. "You know why," he said quietly. "You helped my son. You spoke to him in a language no one outside my immediate circle knows he understands. You calmed him in minutes when therapists couldn't reach him in months." His eyes held mine. "That makes you either very lucky or very dangerous." I needed to know which. "And?" My voice came out steadier than I felt. "What did you decide?" Something flickered across his face, too quick to read. "That we should have this conversation somewhere private." He gestured toward my building. "May I come up?" "Absolutely not." His lips curved slightly, and I realized with a jolt that I'd just amused him. "Ms. Collins, I appreciate your caution, but I'm going to have this conversation with you whether it happens in your apartment or on this street corner with 20 witnesses trying very hard not to stare at us. Your choice." He was right. People were watching, not obviously, but I could feel the weight of hidden attention pressing down on us. And the last thing I needed was to give my neighbors a reason to remember the night a dangerous man waited for me outside my building. "Fine," I said through clenched teeth. "But the door stays open." Agreed. My studio apartment had never felt smaller than it did with Tony Gardner standing in the center of it, his presence filling the space like smoke. He didn't sit, didn't touch anything. Just stood there, hands in his pockets, surveying my life with those dark, assessing eyes. The mismatched furniture I'd collected from thrift stores. The overflowing bookshelf held together with hope and expired wood glue. The tiny kitchen where dishes were perpetually drying in the rack. My laptop open on the coffee table, the screen still showing that damning Google search, Tony Gardner Mafia. His gaze lingered on it for a moment. "You've been researching," he said. Not a question. "Wouldn't you?" "Yes." He turned to face me fully, and I suddenly understood why people feared him. It wasn't just his size or his obvious wealth or the tattooed danger written across his skin. It was the intelligence in those eyes, the way he seemed to see through every defense, every lie, straight down to the trembling truth beneath. which means you know who I am. What I am. Allegedly, I said, crossing my arms. The articles all say alleged. That almost smile again. Smart. But we both know those allegations are careful words chosen by lawyers. You're not stupid, Miss Collins. You know exactly what you're dealing with. Then why are you here? What do you want from me? He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of that dangerous edge, replaced by something raw. My son hasn't spoken Italian since his mother died. 18 months of silence. 18 months of specialists and child psychologists and medications that did nothing but make him sleep. And then you knelt beside him in a park and spoke the language of his grief, and he answered you. He took a step closer. I held my ground. I want you to work with Nico. Be his Italian companion. Help him process what he lost. Help him heal. I'm not a therapist. I have therapists. They're useless. I need someone who understands that language isn't just words, it's memory, it's connection, it's identity. His eyes burned into mine. I need you. No. The word came out stronger than I felt. I can't. I won't. Your world is dangerous, and I want no part of it. $30,000 a month. The number hit me like a physical blow. I made maybe $3,000 on a good month. I don't care about money. Everyone cares about money, Miss Collins. But fine. Let's talk about something you care about more. He stepped closer still, and I could smell his cologne, something dark and expensive that made my head spin. Whether you accept my offer or not, you're under my protection now. I don't want your protection. You misunderstand. His voice dropped to something almost intimate, almost sad. This isn't optional. You helped my son breathe again. You gave him back a piece of his mother. That makes you family. And I protect my family. The words settled over me like a shroud. So I'm a prisoner, I whispered. No. You're protected. There's a difference. He reached into his jacket. I flinched and pulled out a business card, setting it on my coffee table. Think about the job offer. You have 3 days. But understand this, Amber, first time he'd used my first name, and it sounded dangerous in his mouth. You're in my world now. You walked into it the moment you touched my son. The only choice you have left is how you want to exist in it. He moved toward the door, pausing at the threshold. I'll be seeing you soon. And then he was gone, leaving nothing behind but the faint scent of his cologne and the terrible certainty that my life, as I knew it, was over. I lasted 2 days before I called the number on Tony's card. Not because I wanted to. Not because $30,000 a month wasn't tempting, it was, in a way that made me feel sick and ashamed and desperately practical all at once. But because on the second night, I dreamed about Nico's face. Those enormous dark eyes filled with tears. The way his entire body had relaxed when I'd spoken Italian to him, like he'd been holding his breath for 18 months and finally remembered how to exhale. He was just a child. A grieving, lost child who needed help. And somehow, inexplicably, I was the person who could give it to him. Marco picked me up at 10 in the morning in a black Mercedes that probably cost more than my entire education. He was polite, professional, and utterly terrifying in his silence. I spent the 30-minute drive through increasingly exclusive neighborhoods trying not to think about the fact that I was voluntarily entering a crime lord's home. When we finally pulled through security gates that looked like they could withstand a military assault, my breath caught. Tony's estate wasn't a house. It was a compound, a sprawling modern mansion of glass and stone and sharp architectural angles, surrounded by manicured gardens that probably required a full-time staff. It screamed money, power, and the kind of taste that couldn't be bought, only inherited or cultivated over generations. Miss Collins. Marco opened my door. Mr. Gardner is waiting inside. The interior was somehow more intimidating than the exterior. Soaring ceilings, original artwork that I recognized from museum catalogs, furniture that looked like it belonged in design magazines. Everything was immaculate, expensive, and completely devoid of warmth. It felt like a mausoleum built for the living. Tony appeared at the top of a curved staircase, dressed more casually than I'd seen him, dark jeans, a fitted black shirt that showed every line of his athletic build, sleeves rolled to reveal more of those intricate tattoos. He looked younger like this, less like a crime boss and more like a dangerous man trying to remember how to be human. You came, he said, descending the stairs with that same fluid grace that made me think of predators. I came for Nico, I corrected quickly. Not for you. I know. Something flickered in his eyes, approval, maybe, or respect. He's in the playroom. I'll take you. He led me through a maze of hallways, past rooms I only glimpsed, a library, a gym, what looked like an office with the door firmly closed. The house felt enormous and empty, like a beautiful prison built for ghosts. Then I heard it, a child's laugh, bright and sudden, cutting through the heavy silence. Tony stopped outside a door, his hand on the handle, but didn't open it immediately. He's having a good day, he said quietly. They're rare. Most days he just exists. Silent. Present, but not really here. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw genuine vulnerability in those dark eyes. I need you to understand, if you start this, if you help him begin to heal, you can't just walk away. He's lost too many people already. I understand. He held my gaze for another moment, searching for something, then opened the door. The playroom was a stark contrast to the rest of the house, colorful, chaotic, filled with toys and books and art supplies scattered across expensive rugs. And in the center of it all, sitting on the floor with blocks, was Nico. He looked up, and his entire face transformed. Amber. He scrambled to his feet and ran across the room, slamming into my legs with the full force of 5-year-old joy. Sei tornata! Sei tornata! You came back. I knelt down, and he threw his arms around my neck. Certo che sono tornata, Piccolo, I said softly, feeling my throat tighten. Of course I came back, little one. Ti ho promesso, ricordi? I promised you, remember? He pulled back, hands on my shoulders, talking in rapid Italian about everything he wanted to show me, his drawings, his favorite books, the tower he'd been building. The words tumbled out like water from a broken dam, and I realized Tony had been right. This child had been drowning in silence, suffocating in a language he couldn't connect with, and Italian was the only air he knew how to breathe. I spent the next 3 hours with him. We read Italian children's books, the kind with simple words and bright pictures. We played games where he had to tell me in Italian what color blocks he was using, what animals he saw in his picture books. When he got frustrated, old grief rising to the surface, I taught him words for emotions. Triste. Arrabbiato. Solo. Sad. Angry. Lonely. E quando ti senti solo, I told him gently, puoi sempre parlar con me. Okay. And when you feel lonely, you can always talk to me. He nodded, his small hand gripping mine. Through it all, I was aware of Tony. He never entered the room, but I felt him watching from the doorway, silent as a shadow. Once, when I glanced up, I caught him staring with such raw emotion on his face that I had to look away. When Nico finally started yawning, rubbing his eyes, Tony stepped inside. Tempo di riposare, Nico, he said quietly. Time to rest. Ma papa, Amber sta ancora, but dad, Amber is still. Tornerà. Tony's eyes found mine. She'll come back. It wasn't a question. After Nico was taken upstairs for his nap by a kind-faced woman Tony introduced as Maria, the housekeeper, he led me through another corridor to a room I hadn't seen before. This was Giada's studio, he said, opening the door. Nico's mother. The room was frozen in time. An artist's studio filled with canvases in various stages of completion, brushes still soaking in cloudy water, sketches pinned to boards. Light streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like ghosts. She was talented, I said quietly, moving closer to study a half-finished painting of a garden in bloom. She was everything. Tony's voice was rough. She taught Nico Italian from birth. Said it was important he know where half of him came from. When she died, he stopped speaking it. Like the language itself was too painful to hold in his mouth. He turned to face me fully. In 18 months, I've hired 6 specialists. Child psychologists, grief counselors, language therapists. They all tried to reach him in English, tried to help him move forward. His jaw clenched. But you knelt beside him in a park and gave him back his mother's voice. In 20 minutes, you did what they couldn't do in a year. Tony, I don't know how to thank you for that, he continued, and I realized his hands were shaking slightly. I don't know how to repay a gift like that. So I'm asking you, please. Help my son. Help him find his way back. I looked at this dangerous, powerful man standing in his dead wife's studio, stripped of all pretense, just a father begging for his child's salvation. I'll help him, I whispered. I promise. Something passed between us in that moment, an understanding, an acknowledgement, the first thread of connection pulling taut. Tony nodded once, and I could have sworn I saw his eyes brighten with unshed tears. Marco will drive you home, he said roughly. Same time tomorrow? Same time tomorrow. As I left the estate, watching the gates close behind the Mercedes, I realized I'd just crossed a threshold I could never return from. I'd entered Tony Gardner's world, touched his grief, promised to heal his son. And somewhere deep in my chest, beneath the fear and the logic and the certainty that this was dangerous, I felt something else stirring. Something that felt dangerously like belonging. 3 weeks became a routine that felt dangerously close to normal. I arrived at the estate every morning at 10, spent 4 hours with Nico reading, playing, coaxing Italian words from him like flowers from frozen ground, and left by mid-afternoon. Marco drove me both ways, silent and professional. The money appeared in my account every Friday, an amount so absurd I kept checking to make sure it was real. But it wasn't the money that kept me coming back. It was Nico's smile when he saw me. The way he'd started sleeping through the night, according to Maria. The drawings he made for me, crude, beautiful sketches of the three of us, him, me, and his papa, always labeled in careful Italian letters. And if I was honest with myself, it was also Tony. He was always there, hovering at the edges of my time with Nico. Never intrusive, never interrupting, but present in a way that made the air feel charged. I'd look up from a storybook and find him in the doorway, watching with dark, unreadable eyes. I'd hear his voice in the hallway, speaking in rapid Italian to Marco, and feel my pulse quicken at the sound. He'd started timing his schedule around my visits. I noticed because lunch was always ready when Nico and I took breaks, and Tony would join us. At first, the meals were awkward, filled with stilted conversation and long silences. But gradually, something shifted. You studied in Bologna, he asked one afternoon over pasta that his private chef had prepared better than anything I'd eaten in actual Italy. 2 years, I said, watching Nico enthusiastically twirl spaghetti on his fork. Graduate program in linguistics and translation studies. Giada was from Bologna. His voice softened when he said her name. We met there. I was 23, pretending to be someone I wasn't. She saw through me immediately. What did she see? He looked at me over his wine glass, and something in his gaze made my breath catch. Everything I was trying to hide. Everything I was afraid of becoming. He paused. She loved me anyway. Nico, oblivious to the weight of adult conversation, launched into an excited description in Italian of a cartoon he'd watched, and the moment dissolved. But I felt it linger between us like smoke. The touches started innocently enough. Tony's hand on my lower back, guiding me through a doorway. His fingers brushing mine when we both reached for Nico at the same time. The way he'd lean close to murmur something about Nico's progress, his breath warm against my ear, making my skin prickle with awareness. I told myself it meant nothing. Professional courtesy. Casual contact between two adults navigating a child's care. I was lying to myself. The afternoon everything changed. I was in the garden with Nico, teaching him the Italian names for flowers. Tony had mentioned wanting to restore Giada's garden to what it had been before grief had let it fall into elegant neglect. Questo è un girasole, I said, pointing to a sunflower. Poi dirlo. Girasole. Nico repeated, then immediately got distracted by a butterfly, chasing after it with pure 5-year-old abandon. I was smiling, watching him, when I sensed Tony behind me. He's getting better, Tony said quietly. Really better. Not just surviving, but actually living again. He's a resilient kid. I turned to face him, and my breath caught. He'd shed his usual suit jacket, rolled his shirt sleeves to his elbows, revealing the full scope of his tattoos. In the golden afternoon light, He looked less like a crime boss and more like a man who'd forgotten how to be gentle and was desperately trying to remember. "It's not just resilience," he said, his eyes holding mine. "It's you. You brought him back to us." "Tony, let me finish." He stepped closer, and I could smell his cologne, could see the faint scar above his left eyebrow, could feel the heat radiating from his body. "I've been trying to keep my distance, trying to maintain professionalism, boundaries. But I need you to know. Papa, Amber, guard 8. Nico's voice cut through the tension as he came running back, cupping something carefully in his hands. "Una farfalla." The moment shattered, but Tony's eyes promised later. Later came 2 days after that, when I stayed past my usual time because Nico had been having a difficult afternoon, memories of his mother surfacing in waves of tears and Italian words that broke my heart. By the time he finally fell asleep, exhausted from grief, curled on the couch with his head in my lap, it was nearly 7 in the evening. Tony found us like that, Nico sleeping peacefully, my hand stroking his curly hair, both of us bathed in the amber light of the setting sun streaming through the windows. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, just watching. When I looked up, the expression on his face made my heart stutter. "I can carry him to bed," he said quietly, moving into the room with that predatory grace. He lifted Nico with practiced ease, and I followed them upstairs to Nico's bedroom, a space I'd only glimpsed before. It was beautiful, decorated with care, hand-painted murals of Italian landscapes, shelves filled with books in both English and Italian, photographs of a smiling woman with Nico's eyes. "Giada." Tony tucked Nico in with a tenderness that contradicted everything I knew about his reputation, pressing a kiss to his son's forehead and murmuring something in Italian too soft for me to catch. When he straightened, he gestured for me to follow him out. But instead of leading me back downstairs, he took me to the balcony off the second-floor hallway, a space overlooking the gardens and the city lights beginning to sparkle in the distance. "You don't have to drive home yet," he said, his voice rough. "Have dinner with me, please." "Tony, I don't think. I need to say something." He turned to face me fully, and in the twilight, he looked almost vulnerable. "And I need you to listen before you run." My pulse hammered. "Okay. I've been fighting this," he said, each word seeming to cost him something. "Fighting you. From the moment you touched my son in that park, I've been trying to maintain distance, to keep this professional, to pretend that every time you walk into my house you don't make it feel less like a mausoleum and more like a home." "Tony." He stepped closer, and I found myself backed against the balcony railing. "I know what I am, Amber. I know what my world is. I know I have no right to feel what I'm feeling. But watching you with my son, hearing you speak the language my wife taught him, seeing you bring light back into this house," his voice dropped to something raw and honest. "I can't pretend anymore. I can't keep pretending you're just Nico's teacher. What am I then?" I whispered, my heart racing. He reached up slowly, giving me time to pull away, and brushed a curl from my face. His fingers lingered against my cheek, and I shivered despite the warm evening air. "You're the first thing that's made me feel anything other than rage or grief in 2 years," he said quietly. "You're dangerous to my carefully maintained control. And you're absolutely off limits for 1,000 reasons. Then why are we standing here?" His thumb traced my jawline, and his eyes dropped to my lips. "Because I'm a selfish man who's very good at taking what he wants." His voice was barely above a whisper now. "But I'm asking this time, Amber." I kissed him before he could finish the question. I woke in Tony's bed to morning light filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows and the terrifying realization of what I'd done. We'd fallen asleep tangled together, fully clothed, his arms wrapped around me like I was something he couldn't bear to lose. It had felt safe in the darkness. Natural. Right. In the harsh light of morning, it felt like the beginning of the end. I slipped out carefully, trying not to wake him, and found my shoes by the door. My phone showed 6 missed calls from a client and a handful of texts. Reality, demanding my attention. "Running already?" I turned. Tony was awake, propped up on one elbow, watching me with those dark, knowing eyes. His hair was mussed, his shirt wrinkled, and he looked heartbreakingly human. "I have to get home," I said, not quite meeting his gaze. I have work. A life outside of this. He finished my sentence, sitting up fully. Outside of me and Nico and this house. Yes. He was quiet for a long moment, then stood and crossed to where I was frozen by the door. I have something I need to tell you, he said quietly. Something I should have told you before I kissed you. Before I asked you to stay. He gestured toward the sitting area off his bedroom, leather chairs positioned near a fireplace that probably cost more than my yearly income. Please. Sit. The gentleness in his voice scared me more than any threat could have. I sat. Tony poured coffee from a carafe I hadn't noticed, handed me a cup, then settled into the chair across from me. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked uncertain, vulnerable in a way that made my chest tighten. I need you to understand what being with me means, he said. Not the fantasy version from last night. The real version. Tony, let me finish. His hands gripped his coffee cup. My life is violent. Not metaphorically. Not distantly. I have enemies who would kill me without hesitation if they found an opening. I have business rivals who've tried to destroy me, and I've destroyed them in return. The protection you see around Nico, around this house, that's not paranoia. It's necessity. I felt cold despite the warm coffee in my hands. If you're with me, he continued, you'll never be alone again. There will always be security. Always surveillance. Always the knowledge that someone somewhere is watching to make sure you're safe, or looking for a weakness they can exploit. He looked at me directly. You'll live in a cage made of bulletproof glass. A beautiful cage, but a cage nonetheless. I understand. No, you don't. His voice was rough. Not yet. Because there's something else you need to know. He set his cup down, his jaw tight. You asked me once if I knew who I was. What I was. But you've never asked me directly what I've done. My mouth went dry. Tony. Ask me, Amber. Ask me what you need to know before you make any decision about this. About us. My hands were shaking. I set the coffee cup down before I dropped it. Have you killed people? The question hung in the air between us like smoke. Tony didn't flinch. Didn't look away. Didn't soften the truth with euphemisms or justifications. Yes. The single word shattered something in my chest. How many? I whispered. Does the number matter? His eyes held mine. Would 3 be acceptable but 10 wouldn't be? Would knowing they were bad men make it easier to stomach? Because they were rival bosses who tortured their own people, men who trafficked children, monsters who would have killed me and everyone I love if I'd given them the chance. He leaned forward. But I'm not asking you to absolve me, Amber. I'm not looking for redemption. I'm giving you the truth so you can make an informed choice. Tears burned my eyes. I don't know if I can. I know. His voice softened. I know what I'm asking is impossible. I'm asking you to love a man with blood on his hands. To trust someone who lies and manipulates and destroys people as part of his daily business. I'm asking you to build a life in the middle of controlled chaos and pretend it's normal. Then why? The words burst out of me. Why tell me this? Why not just let me believe the fantasy? Because you deserve honesty. He stood, moving to the window, his back to me. And because if you choose to stay, I need you to stay knowing exactly what you're choosing. Not the man I was last night, vulnerable and soft and pretending I'm something I'm not. But the man I am every other day. The one who makes impossible decisions. The one who can't leave this world no matter how much he might want to. I stood on shaking legs, moved to stand beside him at the window. Below, Nico was in the garden with Maria, chasing butterflies in the morning sun, his laughter floating up to us like music. I can't promise you safety, Tony said quietly, still looking down at his son. I can't promise you normalcy. I can't even promise you I'll survive the next year. There are too many people who want me dead. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were raw with emotion. But I can promise you honesty. Respect. Everything I have, everything I am, laid at your feet. And most importantly, his voice cracked slightly. I can promise that Nico will always come first. That whatever happens between us, his healing, his happiness, his future, that's sacred. I looked at this dangerous man, this crime lord, this killer who is also a grieving father and a surprisingly gentle lover. I thought about Nico's laugh, about the way Tony had held me through the night like I was precious, about the life I'd been living before, safe, small, utterly alone. If I stay, I whispered, we do this my way. Hope flared in his eyes. Meaning? Honesty. Always. No matter how ugly the truth is. I swallowed hard. Respect. I'm not your possession. I'm not your employee. If we do this, we're equals or we're nothing. Agreed. And Nico comes first. Always. Before us, before your business, before everything. Always, he said immediately. I need time, I said. I need to think about this. Really think, without you in the same room making me forget all the reasons this is insane. Tony nodded slowly. How much time? A week. I'll still come see Nico, I promised him, and I won't break that promise. But outside of those visits, I need space. Okay. The words seemed to cost him something. 1 week. And Amber. He caught my hand as I moved toward the door. Whatever you decide, thank you. For last night. For Nico. For seeing me as human when most people only see a monster. I left before I could change my mind, before I could throw away my life for a man who just admitted to murder, before I could make the catastrophic mistake of saying I loved him. But as Marco drove me home through the morning traffic, I couldn't shake the image of Tony standing at that window, alone in his beautiful prison, watching his son play and knowing he could never escape the choices that had brought him there. And I couldn't shake the terrible certainty that I'd already made my choice the moment I'd kissed him on that balcony. I just had to find the courage to live with the consequences. The week of space I'd asked for lasted exactly 4 days before everything fell apart. I'd kept my promise to Nico, showing up for our sessions while maintaining careful distance from Tony. He'd respected my boundaries, staying away during my visits, communicating only through brief, professional texts about Nico's progress. It was torture, but necessary. I was finally starting to think clearly again. Then I came home on Thursday evening to find my apartment door hanging open, the lock shattered, and my small sanctuary destroyed. My hands shook as I stood in the hallway, every instinct screaming at me not to enter. But this was my home, my safe space, and someone had violated it. I pulled out my phone to call 911, but another number appeared in my recent calls, bold and unavoidable. Tony. He answered on the first ring. Amber. Someone broke into my apartment, I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the fear clawing at my throat. The door is open. Everything's. Don't go inside. His voice was sharp, commanding. Do you hear me? Do not enter that apartment. Go to a neighbor's. Lock the door. I'm sending Marco now. Tony, I should call the police. Marco will be there in 8 minutes. The police will take 30. Stay with a neighbor. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, colder, lethal. And Amber? This wasn't random. The line went dead. I stood frozen in the hallway as his words sank in. This wasn't random. Of course it wasn't. Random burglars didn't shatter locks, they picked them. Random burglars took electronics and jewelry. From what I could see through my open doorway, nothing was taken. This was a message. A message meant for Tony, delivered through me. Mrs. Chin from 4B opened her door, took one look at my face, and pulled me inside without questions. She made tea I couldn't drink and talked about her grandson while I sat on her floral couch and tried not to shake apart. Marco arrived in exactly 8 minutes, along with 3 other men in dark suits. They swept my apartment with military efficiency while I waited with Mrs. Chin, feeling like a character in a movie I never auditioned for. When Marco emerged, his face was grim. Miss Collins, I need you to come with me. But my apartment is a crime scene. Mr. Gardner has already contacted the police. They're on their way. But you can't stay here tonight. I'll stay with a friend. Mr. Gardner insists you come to the estate. For your safety. It wasn't a request. The drive to Tony's mansion was silent and tense. Marco's jaw was tight, his phone ringing constantly with calls he answered in clipped Italian. Through the partition, I heard fragments. Breached perimeter, sending a message, wants her scared. They were right. I was terrified. When we pulled through the estate gates, Tony was waiting outside the front entrance. The moment the car stopped, he wrenched open my door and pulled me out, his hands frantically checking me over for injuries. Are you hurt? Did they touch you? Did you see anyone? I'm fine. I wasn't home when it happened. Thank God. He pulled me against his chest, his arms wrapping around me so tightly I could barely breathe. His heart was hammering. Thank God. I felt him shaking. Tony. He pulled back, his hands framing my face, his eyes blazing with fury barely contained beneath the surface. You're not going back there, he said, his voice deadly calm. Not tonight. Not ever. You're staying here. You can't just. I can and I will. His thumb brushed my cheek. This is my fault. They targeted you to get to me. And I will not, his voice cracked. I will not lose another person I care about because I was too proud or too stubborn to protect them properly. Who did this? Rivals. Enemies. People who think hurting you will weaken me. His jaw clenched. They're right. And they'll pay for it. The cold certainty in his voice sent ice through my veins. Tony, don't. This isn't negotiable, Amber. He took my hand, leading me inside. You wanted honesty? Here it is. You entered my world the moment you touched my son. I've been trying to give you space, trying to let you make a choice, but that choice was taken from you the second someone decided you mattered to me. We were in his office now, a room I'd never seen before, all dark wood and leather and windows overlooking the grounds. He poured amber liquid into a crystal glass and handed it to me. Drink. I did, the whiskey burning my throat. Tony stood at the window, his back rigid, his hands clenched into fists. I've already sent people to your apartment to pack your things, he said. Marco will handle communication with your landlord, terminate your lease, forward your mail. You'll have a room here, your own space, complete privacy. Or, he turned to face me. You can stay with me. In my room. My bed. No pretense. No more distance. You're not giving me a choice. I'm giving you the only choice you have left. He crossed to me, kneeling so we were eye level, taking my shaking hands in his. I'm not asking you to be my prisoner, Amber. I'm begging you to let me keep you alive. Tears burned my eyes. This is insane. I know. His voice was raw. I know it's too much, too fast, too dangerous. But it's the truth. You're in danger because of me. And I will move heaven and earth to protect you, even if you hate me for it. I don't hate you. The words tumbled out before I could stop them. I should. God knows I should. But I don't. Something shifted in his expression, relief and anguish mixed together. Then stay, he whispered. Stay with me. Let me protect you. Let me, he stopped, his throat working. Let me love you, even though I have no right to. I looked at this dangerous man kneeling before me, this killer who was also somehow the most honest person I'd ever met, and I realized the choice had been made weeks ago. Maybe even in that park, when I'd first knelt beside his son. Okay, I whispered. His eyes closed, and I could have sworn I saw tears on his lashes. Okay, he repeated, pulling me into his arms. And in that moment, surrounded by luxury purchased with blood money, held by a man who'd admitted to murder, I felt safer than I'd ever felt in my careful, controlled, utterly predictable life. Even if that safety was an illusion. Even if love and danger had become so tangled I couldn't tell them apart anymore. That night, I moved into Tony's bedroom with a single suitcase Marco had packed from my destroyed apartment. Tony held me through the night, his arms tight around me, his lips against my hair. I'm going to marry you, he whispered into the darkness, so quietly I almost thought I'd imagined it. Maybe not today. Maybe not this month. But soon, Amber Collins. Soon. I should have been terrified. Instead, I laced my fingers through his and whispered back, okay, and felt his smile against my temple as we both fell into dreams where danger couldn't follow. At least not yet. 6 months later, I woke to sunlight streaming through windows I'd learned to call my own and the sound of Nico's laughter echoing through the halls. 6 months of learning to live in Tony's world, a world of constant security, carefully planned outings, and the strange cognitive dissonance of eating breakfast with a man who might have ordered someone's death before his morning coffee. 6 months of watching Nico blossom from a silent, grieving child into a vibrant boy who spoke Italian as easily as breathing, who drew pictures of our strange little family with crayons and unshakable certainty. 6 months of falling deeper in love with a man I should have run from. It hadn't been easy. There were nights I woke from nightmares about masked men breaking through doors. Days when I read news articles about violence in the city and wondered if Tony's name was attached to it in ways the papers couldn't prove. Moments when I caught him on the phone, his voice cold and merciless, and remembered exactly what he was capable of. But there were also mornings like this one, peaceful, domestic, almost normal. I found Tony in the kitchen, dressed casually in jeans and a fitted black shirt, making pancakes while Nico sat at the counter practicing his Italian vocabulary words. The scene was so beautifully ordinary it made my chest ache. "Buongiorno, amore," Tony said, looking up as I entered. "Good morning, love." "Amber." Nico abandoned his workbook and launched himself at me. "Papa sta facendo I pancake. Con lagacci di cioccolato." Dad's making pancakes. With chocolate chips. I caught him, lifting him into a hug. "Sounds perfect, Piccolo." Tony's eyes met mine over Nico's head, warm and soft in a way he reserved only for these private moments. In public, the few times we ventured out, he was still the cold, untouchable crime lord. But here, in the sanctuary of his home, he allowed himself to be just Tony. Just a father and a man trying to build something good from the wreckage of his past. After breakfast, Tony asked Nico to go play in his room for a bit. The boy obliged happily, still young enough not to question when adults needed to talk. "I need to show you something," Tony said once we were alone. "Come with me." He led me through the house and out into Giada's garden, the space we'd been slowly restoring together over the past months. What had been elegant neglect was now blooming back to life. Rose bushes Maria had carefully pruned, herb gardens I'd helped replant, stone pathways cleared of weeds. It was beautiful in the morning light, and somehow still peaceful despite being surrounded by walls and security cameras. Tony stopped in the center of the garden, near a fountain that had recently been restored to working order. He looked nervous, which immediately set my heart racing. I'd seen Tony face down rival bosses and federal investigators without flinching. Nerves on him were terrifying. "Tony? What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." He took my hands in his. "Everything is. Actually, everything is more right than I ever thought my life could be again." Before I could respond, I heard a small sound behind me. I turned to find Nico standing at the garden entrance, holding something in his hands and grinning like he had the world's best secret. "Nico? What are you?" The little boy walked forward solemnly, like he'd been practicing this moment, and held up a small velvet box. My heart stopped. "Papa Dice," Nico announced proudly in Italian, "Che tu sei la luce della nostra casa." "Dad says you're the light of our house." Tony took the box from his son, his hands steady even though his eyes were suspiciously bright. Then he knelt on the stone pathway, right there in his dead wife's garden, and looked up at me with an expression so full of love it made my breath catch. "Amber Collins," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "6 months ago, you walked into my world and changed its fate. You brought my son back from the edge of grief. You made this house feel like a home instead of a mausoleum. You looked at the monster everyone else fears and saw a man worth loving." Tears were already streaming down my face. "I can't promise you a normal life," he continued. "I can't promise you safety or simplicity or any of the things you deserve. But I can promise you honesty, loyalty, everything I have, everything I am, for as long as I'm alive." He opened the box, revealing a ring that took my breath away, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds, elegant and understated and absolutely perfect. "Be my wife, Amber. Build a life with me and Nico. Let me spend the rest of my days trying to deserve you." I looked at this man kneeling before me, this killer, this father, this impossibly complicated person who'd somehow become my entire world. I thought about all the reasons I should say no. The danger, the moral complexity, the life I'd be choosing that bore no resemblance to any future I'd imagined for myself. And then I looked at Nico, bouncing excitedly on his toes, waiting for my answer with the pure faith only children possess. "Yes," I whispered. "Yes, Tony. Yes." Nico cheered and launched himself at both of us, nearly knocking Tony over. Tony caught him with one arm while sliding the ring onto my finger with his other hand, and then he was kissing me while our son, because that's what Nico had become, laughed and hugged us both. Ti amo, Tony murmured against my lips. I love you. Ti amo, I whispered back. That evening, after Nico had finally exhausted himself and fallen asleep, Tony and I stood on the balcony where we'd first kissed, looking out at the city lights. Do you regret it? He asked quietly. Any of it? The choice you made to stay. I thought about my old life, small, safe, utterly predictable. I thought about the woman I'd been 6 months ago, translating documents in her studio apartment, convinced her biggest adventure was already behind her. No, I said honestly. I'm terrified half the time. I still don't know how to reconcile loving you with knowing what you've done. But regret? No. Never. He pulled me against his chest, and I felt him exhale, like he'd been holding his breath for months waiting for that answer. I'll keep you safe, he promised. Whatever it takes. For the rest of my life. I know. And I did know. Tony Gardner was a dangerous man who lived in a dangerous world. But he was also a man who kept his promises, who loved with a fierce and unshakable devotion, who'd kneel in his dead wife's garden and offer his heart to a woman who had every reason to refuse it. We'd both made impossible choices to be here. And somehow, impossibly, we'd built something beautiful from them. Below us, Marco and the other security personnel maintained their eternal vigilance, keeping watch over our strange little family. Above us, stars competed with city lights for attention. And between us, in the space where danger and love had learned to coexist, there was peace. Not the absence of threat, that would never exist in Tony's world. But something better, the certainty that whatever storms came, we'd face them together. 3 months later, we married in that same garden, with Nico as our ring bearer and Marco as Tony's best man. It was small, private, guarded by armed men in expensive suits who cried when Nico gave a toast in halting English-Italian about how his mama in heaven had sent us amber. And 1 year after that, when federal investigators came knocking again with questions Tony's lawyers deflected with practiced ease, I stood beside him through it all, not blind to what he was, but choosing love anyway. Because sometimes the most dangerous choice is also the bravest one. Sometimes the person who saves you is the last person who should. And sometimes, just sometimes, a lost child crying in a park can change the fate of an empire.